to the second week of Daily Debrief, your primer or international news, which is brought to you by People's Dispatch. I am Swastika, and let's get into our first story. Now, 136 countries have agreed upon a minimum of 15% tax for corporates. The discussions were held by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Now, they were aimed at finding a solution to some countries offering corporates huge tax benefits. This tax could bring as much as $150 billion in additional revenue. There have been some critiques to this proposal, though with many countries calling it not enough. Earlier, Prashant of People's Dispatch spoke to Daniel Bertoza of Public Services International on the nature of this proposal. Let's listen in.
Thank you so much for joining us. So just quickly wanted to ask you about the process. Just quickly wanted to ask you about the process that has led to this agreement by 136 countries. This has been in the discussion for a long time, a lot of proposals, in fact. So could you maybe just take us through the nitty-gritty, so to speak?
Sure. This agreement really is far too little, far too late. The original process came about in 2009 after the global financial crisis, when there was a realization that some of the largest winners of globalization weren't paying their fair share. In particular, digital multinationals, but other multinationals as well. And what the OECD and the G20 tried to do at that time was to create or change the rules to tax the digital economy, which was increasingly avoiding being taxed, to tax where economic activity was taking place, and also to raise revenue. And it's really failed on two of those areas, the taxing digital economy and also taxing where economic activity takes place. Although it is raising a little bit extra revenue, but most of that revenue is going to the home countries of corporations. And over that period of time, there's been a series of discussions, but at each step of the way, some of the large and powerful countries have tried to protect the corporations that operate in their own jurisdiction, and so they've been watered down, and various proposals have been rejected or pushed further down the road. So we're 12 years down the road, and what we have is a very, very marginal improvement on a set of rules that were really established in the 1920s and are not at all suitable for the modern globalized economy. And the basic problem is that corporations are able to pass their profits through tax havens. And so that's making everybody poorer. It's making workers poorer because there's not enough wages on the table in the countries where the workers are creating the value, and there's not enough money to fund public services. And what this deal has essentially done, is said that we'll create a 15% minimum effective rate, which is certainly better than what was happening in the past, where a lot of these corporations were paying 2 or 3%, almost nothing. But then they've given that right to the home country, the country in which that corporation has its home. So if you have a large, say, US corporation that has production facilities in Asia or Africa and is selling into Europe, the Africans and the Asians and the Europeans are all part of the economic activity of that corporation. They're not getting anything at the moment, and at the moment the US is not getting anything either. The new rules will essentially allow that tax to be shifted from the tax havens, say Switzerland or the British Virgin Islands, but all of the revenue will go to the US, where the company is headquartered, or other headquartered companies. And that really is quite disappointing for most of us who are looking for not just to have these companies pay more tax, but for that tax to be shared equally in the countries where the economic activity is taking place. There's also some problems because whilst that was the OECD's stated aim, many of us who want a fairer and more just globalization have set some other tests. And one is that the taxation of multinationals is fair. Two is that it's simpler, because the more you complicate the process, the easier it is to dodge. And third is that we stop tax competition. And again, on our tests, this deal has failed too. It's not fairer. It's reinforcing the current allocation of taxing rights to the home countries, which are largely the global north, but not exclusively. It's not simpler, because it's it's making better rules, but it's overlaying them across the old unfair rules. So it's much more complicated. It is interesting in that for the first time, we're seeing a shift in the debate away from the idea that tax competition is good. And the OECD early on and throughout the process has said it's either good to have tax competition amongst countries or it's neutral and it's not really their business to deal with it. And I think what Biden's proposal has done, which really shifted the whole debate when he announced it earlier this year, is he and Janet Yellen have come out very clearly and said tax competition is bad for everybody. It's bad for workers, it's bad for governments, and the only people that benefit from tax competition are tax havens and multinational tax dodgers. And that's a good shift. That's a very important shift. Of course, what we've seen since that point, because he also announced 21% as his preferred rate, what we've seen is a lot of countries coming in and defending their own tax havens or defending their own corporations, and that ambition that was never high, but was certainly a shift, a really important shift, has been whittled away until we've seen the latest announcement for which there is really very little ambition left.
Right. Thank you so much for talking to us.
In our next story, US and Taliban delegations held discussions over the weekend in Doha, in Qatar. This is the first round of talks between them since the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and the Taliban takeover. Now, lots of speculation regarding these talks. Let's talk to Prashant about what seems to be the wish list for both the sides.
Right, Swastika, a lot of very complicated discussion, in fact, both sides having very different agenda. So let's take the United States first. Now, of course, on the face of it, the US has come out with slogans about how they're going to measure Taliban by their deeds. They talked about repatriation of people. They talked about human rights. But let's be honest, the real question for the US is how to get back into Central Asia and specifically Afghanistan, because we saw that they were booted out pretty unceremoniously over the past few months. And they do know that Russia, China, Pakistan to a large extent, some of the Central Asian countries, many of these players now have a huge role. Iran have a huge role in Afghanistan. And they're kind of concerned about the fact that they don't have that much space. Now, there's always been a school of thought which has said that the US and the Taliban did maintain some kind of contacts nonetheless. But this is probably an attempt to sort of strengthen that further. And as some observers have pointed out, it's noteworthy that the CIA is probably leading or is in the forefront of these discussions. So which means that there is possibly also a very strong intelligence aspect to these discussions. Maybe they're looking at whether the CIA or intelligence can actually establish some kind of presence in Afghanistan. And we do know, of course, that over the past many years, the recurring theme of US policy has been China. And if there's one thing the US wants right now, it is to restrict China's presence in various other countries, its influence, etc. So one key element definitely is that.
Also, this does bring about a lot of change in the regional politics and the dynamics,
absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. And also in this context, we need to sort of note what the Taliban wants also, because as far as the Taliban is concerned, their biggest problem right now is the economic crisis.
Yes.
And the economic crisis is really, really bad. In fact, I think estimates show that nearly 75% of Afghanistan's government expenditure was based on international donations.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, that has been cut off. But more importantly, the fact is that immediately after the Taliban took over, the US froze some $9 billion worth of Afghanistan central bank assets. So releasing that is a huge question as far as the Afghans are concerned. So right now for the Taliban, actually, probably the biggest question right now is solving the economic crisis. Because as we do know, what happened is that the Taliban came to power very quickly.
Yes.
Which meant that it probably struck alliances and agreements with a lot of local warlords, a lot of local chiefs. And all of these agreements run on the basis of the fact that the Taliban can provide a stable government as opposed to the previous government, right? But if they do not have the money to do this, we will soon see ruptures within these alliances. There might be the possibilities of infighting. So I think the Taliban is very determined, very clear that they want to avoid that. And so for that reason, they're very concerned about that. So these are, I would say, the most two main driving themes. There is, of course, the issue of the Islamic State of Khorasan, of the so-called group of ISISK. Now, the Taliban has said they don't need support for that. So that's, of course, there.
Also, the US is looking to use the human rights issue as a plug to still find a way to converse and enter into Afghanistan, isn't it?
Absolutely. And in this context, of course, that your second question is important because, like we saw, in the past few months, the regional players have become really important.
Yeah.
So China, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, the Central Asian countries, you have Uzbekistan, you have Tajikistan. So the United States also trying to work with some of them. So there's a lot of these rivalries that are playing out right now with Afghanistan as the center. So we do also know that Russia on its own is starting a new dialogue process involving all these countries as well, because they want to make sure that that there is some kind of consensus over there. Pakistan has been insisting for a very long time that these sanctions on Taliban be withdrawn. They're probably the biggest advocates of these sanctions, the sanctions that are to be withdrawn. China has engaged the Taliban to some extent, but in some senses, both China and Russia have some limitations in how much they can fund the Taliban government. So that may still depend on the Western powers, so to speak, and Western agencies. So a lot of imponderables right now in this issue. The key question here, of course, is whether all these countries, including the US, can sort of work together in a comprehensive and holistic way, or whether the US and the Western countries are going to likely play spoilsport, whether they'll try to turn one country against another, whether they'll use Afghanistan as a way to sow divisions among neighbors. So that's really your million-dollar question, so to speak, because if the second situation is what happens, we're looking for a lot of chaos, we're looking for a lot of uncertainty, especially for the people of Afghanistan, because what is needed right now is for money to flow in, is for basic governance to happen. Like we've talked about many times before, nobody approves of the values of the Taliban, nobody in any way endorses what the Taliban stands for. But the fact is that right now, the people of Afghanistan do need some amount of stability. Otherwise, in addition to the lack of other rights that are already there, what we'll be seeing is a dramatic decline in economic conditions, right? Will Afghanistan end up like another Yemen? It's a horror scenario. So the real hope really is that all these countries sort of work together, do not play neighbors against neighbors, and there is some kind of a stable understanding to ensure that the standard of living for most Afghans actually improves.
Well, thank you so much. And we will keep looking into what is developing in Afghanistan vis-a-vis even the economic crisis.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Prashant. Now for our third story, let's take a look at what's grabbing the headlines in news from India. It is the energy crisis that is looming on some states that include Delhi, Punjab, Kerala, Rajasthan, Tamil Nadu. Now, there seems to be a depletion in the coal stocks. And to know about what is causing it, let's go over to Prabir Purkayastha, who is editor-in-chief of NewsClick. Prabir, what is causing this depletion in the coal supply?
Well, that is one part of the answer which I'm definitely going to give you, but it's not restricted to India alone. We are having problems of this kind in other parts of the world too. China, for example, which is also facing a shortage of coal as well as electricity supplies. And again, this is also spreading to other parts of the world. So we have a bigger crisis on our hands than just an Indian crisis, and I think we should be aware of that. Coming to the Indian crisis, already certain states are facing power cuts. What we call electricity shortages, essentially load shedding is already on. So it's not that it is only going to happen in certain states. Of course, Delhi being affected becomes global as well as national news.
Capital city.
Capital city of the country. But already power cuts have started. We have the reports of what is called the grid regulator, POSOCO, who really does look at all of this variations between supply and demand. And already we can see figures of load shedding taking place in different states. Why is there a shortage of coal? Because of course, India's primary energy source is still coal. 75% of our electricity demand is met by coal. So that is obviously a big source of whatever electricity we generate. And this is also the period where the coal stocks, as you said, are low. Why are the coal stocks low? Normally during the monsoons, the coal stocks do tend to dip because mining is difficult. There are floods that takes place in some of the areas. So transportation also tends to get hit. And of course, you have surplus of hydroelectricity because of the rains. And therefore, the hydroelectricity supplies a lot of the power. So the coal plants, therefore, do not need to supply as much to the grid as otherwise they would. So when you have the monsoons, there are two things that happen. One is, of course, the supply gets affected. There are floods. There could be excessive rains, making it difficult to do also mining of coal in certain places, which are open cast mines. Those are kind of things that happen. But also you have surplus hydroelectric power, which therefore you continuously pump into the grid, and you can therefore allow for a lack of coal supplies for that period. You need to build up your coal stock before the monsoons, because we know during the monsoons the coal supplies will dip. What happened is that did not seem to have that did not happen, and the stocks were not replenished. And then when this has happened now, that you don't have now hydropower in abundance, your non-conventionals are also not supplying as much as they could. There you have the base load has to be met by coal, and you have a shortage of coal. There's roughly 4 days of average stock in the coal plants is what we're hearing, but some plants have already run out of coal. So they have zero stocks. So you also see that happening. If we take the larger picture into account, this is a global scenario. Yeah. This is not restricted to India alone. So coal supplies, if they have to be now bought from the international market, the prices of coal has gone up 3 to 4 times. What used to be $60 per ton is now $200 per ton. Also, you have shortage of other kinds, which is not affecting India directly, but for instance, the oil supplies and LNG supplies, which is basically gas supplies, where also other countries, like European countries, are also facing the same crunch, that they have a shortfall of LNG. Gas prices, oil prices have gone through the roof. Yeah. So you have a much larger imbalance between what the so-called green power can supply and what the carbon emitting supplies, essentially coal and oil, can do. Also gas can do. So I think what we need to have is a much better understanding that the markets, which is what was thought to solve all the problems of the world, along with carbon credits, will solve the problem of the imbalance between what you need to do as countries for the long-term greening of the world, which is basically cutting down your coal emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, and also how to meet the localized problems that you get, sudden dips of, say, coal supplies. How do you manage that? In both, what you are seeing is a failure of the market, and that is something we already know, that markets fail when you deal with infrastructure projects, and this is not amenable to market solutions. You need to plan for this, whether you want green energy or whether you want to really maintain your coal stocks to the level that you can meet shortages. And I think this is the clear answer we get from the global crisis we see, as well as the Indian crisis. Markets cannot solve this problem. You have to plan for it, and it has to be a planned intervention that can address such problems.
And finally, in our section of the show where we examine bizarre news from around the world, we're talking about the so-called Havana Syndrome. Now, US President Joe Biden has signed a law providing financial support to victims of this syndrome, which refers to headaches and nausea suffered by US diplomats. Sections of the US media have claimed that microwave attacks are the reason for this. Now, let's go back to Prashant and talk about what seems to be the reason for targeting the US diplomats in this so-called sonic attacks.
Good question, Swastika, because this is one of the most bizarre bits of news we've been reading or covering in recent times. And the crazy thing, of course, is that the US government is actually, given it a term, given it respectability by saying that it's Hawana Syndrome. Whereas actually a study published a couple of years ago by an agency actually said that probably most of these conditions were psychosomatic.
Okay.
And that the so-called noise that most of these diplomats and officers talked about hearing was crickets. Yeah. So it's called the Hawana Syndrome because it was first reported in Havana.
Okay.
And that's important to note because this has been given the nature of some sort of international secret war against the United States. There have been talks about Cuban intelligence being behind it. There have been talks about Russian intelligence being behind it. And it's unbelievable that some of the most reputed organizations in the world have been carrying this out, whereas the most likely explanation is pointed out time and again is that this is a purely psychosomatic issue. Now, again, the worst part here, of course, is that we're talking about the United States, which had devised so many ways to try to assassinate Fidel Castro. And that's, when you think of the US and Cuba, that's one of the first things you think of, the sheer number of incredible ways in which they sort of tried to assassinate the head of a sovereign country because they did not like the politics of Cuba, they did not like the communist path Cuba was taking, and they wanted to try to discredit them. So it's coming from there. This just seems a continuation of that book of dirty tricks, only in a defensive way, so to speak. So I think we need to be a bit more cautious about these kind of topics, because when we say sonic weapons, microwave attacks, it just sounds very
out there.
Yeah, very out there.
Yeah.
Whereas the reasons could be as simple and basic as crickets.
Well, then that's that. Thank you, Prashant, for this little bit. And well, this is all we have for today. Do join us tomorrow for yet another episode of Daily Debrief.